So with me now, I've got Gurdeep Singh Kohli, SC Ventures, Standard Chartered Bank. Thanks very much for coming. Very pleased to see Priya Guha. Thanks very much for coming along, venture partner at Merian Ventures. We've got Sanat Rao, Senior Vice President, Head of Fintech, Infosys. And also we are joined virtually by Swastik Nigam, founder of Winvesta. Thank you very much for coming. And also, I think we are going to be saying goodbye to our previous guest, Amitabh Kant. Thank you very much for being with us. Really appreciate your time with us here today at India Global Forum. So we'll come to our panel now. So let's start off. Priya, why don't you build on what we heard there and tell me if you've got anything to add in particular, especially around what has made India such a strong hub for fintech development.
So, I mean, I think, what you have seen in India, as Amitabh so eloquently described, is just a real boom in this sector in recent years, in particular, through a combination of economic growth across the economy, but also some fantastic initiatives that have really stimulated the sort of pressure points that can help an economy explode. And I suppose the only thing that would be worth adding to what Amitabh's comments are is that I think this has had both a fantastic economic benefit across the board, but has also had multiple knock-on benefits. And the one that springs to mind is the opportunity for inclusion. So we're talking about inclusion as one of the elements to fintech in this panel, and I think what you've seen is an access to capital for people who would never historically have had that access. And what that creates, particularly if you're thinking about something like gender inclusion, for example, is bringing in a whole new sector into the economy and allowing those people who might have historically been excluded to participate and bring their own economic engine to the growth engine that is India, which is a fantastic part of the story.
And what happens when you bring women into the engine, Priya?
Well, I mean, I think you just see a transformational shift in the potential because you've just got a new force in the economy, but you also have different businesses, different ideas. And I think what you have seen with this growth of inclusion in the financial sector in India is a whole new series of markets opening that were previously just completely untapped. And I think that's where real economic growth lies, a future that allows everybody to participate to their full.
So let's come to you, Gurdeep. What are India's aspirations from here, do you think? And in the pre-fintech world, cities like London, New York, Singapore were the financial hubs. But when do you think we'll see India having its own fintech hubs start to challenge?
Sure, thank you. I think Amitabh touched on the right word, which is the ingredients are there. And if I was to name, like say 5 ingredients which India already has, one is talent, and I'll come back to this point in a minute. The second is capital. I think we have heard so much today, which is there is enough capital available onshore and from global. Third is policies and regulations. And that's the interesting bit, which I think needs a bit of work. And then the fourth is just the market itself. Many fintech hubs are actually struggling because the local markets itself are very small. So that does not allow for the fintech to grow. And the fifth is actually a very well-established banking sector and a very well-regulated banking sector. Now, if I was to think about what does it take for India to go to the next level, I'll borrow at least one attribute from, let's say, the Silicon Valley, Singapore, and UK. And I was reflecting on what can I borrow, what can India borrow? So when I look at the valley, which is why is the Silicon Valley so different? Actually, the diversity of talent is what we have been reflecting on, having moved from Singapore and comparing notes with the valley is diversity. And it is gender, it is nationality. It's also the skill sets. Everybody talks about India's engineering talent, tech talent, banking talent. There is one talent aspect, which is the creative talent. So you do need product creativity, you do need marketing creativity, which sometimes I believe India is not tapping enough of, which is why you don't see global fintechs from India still coming up. What can we borrow from the likes of UK, for example? When it talks about policies and regulations, some of these regulators have done a pretty good job of actually saying, here is the sandbox, you can play with it. Here are the tax benefits. When I came to the UK recently, surprisingly, you have individuals. You get tax advantages for actually becoming a seed or an angel investor in the fintechs. I think somebody else already mentioned the local. You have to be self-reliant on the local capital, and that is something which we can learn from and do a better job of. And the third thing, when I was looking at Singapore, what can India learn from Singapore? Raising the game, which is, this is the season of fintechs now. I mean, I'm sure everybody's being invited to hundreds of them, but the magnitude of scale with which Singapore does the Singapore Fintech Festival, I would love to see India raising the bar. And I will finish by saying, when it comes to the infrastructure, it is not just the data infrastructure, not just the digital infrastructure, it's also about the real infrastructure. Bangalore has been established, absolutely, as one of the hubs. We are working on the Gujarat, which is the gift city, and the bank is part of that. The bank is an advisor to the gift city and also one of the first foreign banks to set up operations in the gift city. But I'm sure India has so many cities to build on, but beyond just the data infrastructure, we need real infrastructure, which matters to the young people a lot. So let me pause there as what can India do to the next level?
Sanat, let's come to you, and I'd love you to reflect on anything you've heard so far, but also tell me how you think fintech development in India is helping Indian banks leap forward and help set India on the path to becoming a power economy.
Sure. But before I answer your question, let me just go back to the previous point that was being discussed. And I think often we underestimate the impact that the India stack as an infrastructure has supported what Amitabh Khan talked about in terms of setting up a truly digital economy. Mind you, for fintechs to survive, right, they come with a proposition that everything is digital end to end. Now, if the rest of the infrastructure in the country is not supporting that, then they can't thrive. And I think we often don't give credit to the whole India stack, the 4 layers of the India stack, and how that has facilitated a lot of what Mr. Amitabh Khan talked about. That, I think, has created the platform and the environment to be able to allow these fintechs to thrive. That's point number 1. Point number 2, I think, is that for a long time, India was being seen as an offshore, low-cost destination. I don't believe that we are giving enough attention at the moment to try and shed that image. Right? The fact that a lot of global companies are looking at India as a destination where they do a lot of their back office processing, that's great, that's good, it's giving a lot of employment to local people, that needs to continue. But I think, like Gurdeep said, look at the way Singapore has emerged as a hub. It's because there's been a dedicated focus to creating a certain message internally within the economy and outside, that the ecosystem is ripe for young entrepreneurs who want to sort of get into innovative new areas to be able to, experiment and thrive there. The big advantage, I think, is because India has such a large domestic economy, right? The opportunity for many people to compete and do well is far greater than in many other smaller economies where if one succeeds, the other one has to fail. Right? And I think that's a big, big difference for India, which very few other economies offer. I've forgotten the question you asked me.
Me too. Oh, what was my question? The question was, how can fintech development in India help banks leap forward?
So I think, great, sorry about that. So a couple of things. Even when fintech started, like we've seen in many parts of the world, right? I think there was this phase of varying degrees where fintechs and banks were seen as competitors. And I think in many economies that has been sort of moved to the back because I think people have realized that fintechs need banks and banks need fintechs. I think when I look at the Indian market, we didn't necessarily see that kind of a tug of war between them. I think to that extent the fintechs and the banks worked more collaboratively much earlier in their own evolution. That's point number 1. Point number 2 is that when banks are given the brand permission to be able to experiment, innovate, and take something new to their clients and constituents, they need to have the right infrastructure within their own organizations, from back to front. A lot of what we call as digital nowadays is what you and I as individuals see at the front end. Right? But when banks have creaky back-end systems, it's going to hinder their progress there. I think go back to the early part of this decade where a lot of the banks in India, including the large public sector banks, they put the right attention on ensuring that the back-end infrastructure was addressed. So today, many of the economies, not just in India, but indeed in parts of Southeast Asia, are far ahead of their counterparts in the Western world. Right? And that's creating the platform, it's creating the right digital infrastructure for them to be able to experiment and do that. So I think India has, the fintechs in India and the banks in India are able to do that. Last but not the least, mind you, I think the demographic profile in India, the very young demographic profile in India, is ripe for these kind of offerings, right? Often we talk about entrepreneurs being young, right? But if their clients, if their constituents, if their, the profile that they're reaching out to are not necessarily of the same mindset because they're not comfortable with digital, right? There's going to be a bit of a mismatch. India has the largest young population in the world. I'm talking about between 25 and 35 years. It's got what, I think 600 million or thereabouts, right? That's a ripe population for these fintechs to experiment with because they're hungry for new technology, they're willing to experiment. Today, that strata of the economy, of the population, has the financial wherewithal to be able to take certain risks. I think all of this is making it easier for the fintechs to survive. So these are some of the factors, and I'm sure we'll discuss more.
Well, let's go to Swastik because he runs a fintech, in fact, and I'd love you to say a little bit more about your customers. Are you finding that your customers are eager, they're jumping in, they're just as digitally ready as we've been hearing they must be?
Yeah, no, that's actually a very, just following on from Sanat's point, right? There are various segments of customers, and we find that their interaction with fintechs vary significantly. It goes back also to one of the first questions that you asked in terms of the factor of talent. India's got a very, very deep pool of talent, and that talent, in fact, very often is a very large customer base for many of the younger fintechs like ourselves as well, because they're ready, they're willing to try out new products, new offerings. As you might have learned, India's got, in fact, possibly now the second largest crypto client base, possibly in the world, right? So there is, of course, a fascination, an increasing fascination and acceptance of new products, while at the same time, the need for trust, right, in financial services in a place like India is quite high. And that's why still many of the traditional players get an outsized part of the market, even without having necessarily great user experience or great products as well. So it's a fine and interesting, almost barbell-shaped segmentation where you see both of these markets flourishing in a certain kind, yet the customer types are becoming heavily segmented with certain ideas being still very physically oriented, but the younger emerging class wants to try this in a fintech first manner.
And you are working on cross-border investments. How closely do you work with banks?
Yeah, in fact, pointing back to one of the earlier points mentioned, which is about regulations. So cross-border movement of capital is still heavily regulated. So in fact, we do need to work with a very large number of players, whether it's banks, whether it is remittance platforms and the likes. And this goes back to an emerging and increasing collaboration, because in a place where the regulator is trying to preserve, everyone, and especially trying to preserve and protect those at pretty much the bottom of the pyramid, right? The regulation tries to be, drawing a broad brushstroke on establishing that capital flows, etc., need a greater amount of control than what we would have seen in much of the developed world. And that creates great opportunity for collaboration, because with many of the traditional players, they see us as ways to originate new client sets or provide more value to their current clients, to their current client base. And for us, many of the traditional banks and financial services firms are a necessary part of us being able to build a large, broad-based business ourselves as well.
Thank you. Gurdeep, let's come back to you. And I spoke about the credit issue with Amitabh Khan for a moment, but I would like to get your view as well, because we've seen fintech enable this lending growth, opening up credit to businesses that couldn't previously get it. Can you describe a little bit more of that story and tell me how you see the future of it?
I think it's a fundamental, very important shift which is already happening, which is leveraging alternate data for credit models. It is so important to lift the participation, and we talked about inclusion of the economies which were earlier neglected. So very similar points to what Amitabh just made. We as SC Ventures actually have a venture in India called Solve, which is targeting the MSMEs and leveraging alternate data to create a Solve score to provide access to credit, to help drive commerce. And we also have just invested as a bank in buy now, pay later fintech, one of the biggest investments we have made in Asia and Singapore. What we learned is that there are a lot of experiments which are still going on. It is still in early stages, which is the leveraging of alternate data to build scalable business models. I think the experiments have been more successful at the lower end of the pyramid, which is for mass and consumer segment. The experiments, I would say, are still ongoing when it comes to SME or MSME segment. And what needs to happen is that while fintechs can push the boundaries and create new models, for the models to learn, for the models to get better, the FIs and the banks actually need to adopt those models. So many times you will see that the traditional banks will actually be very conservative to say, I don't want to experiment with new models, and therefore the fintechs can create models, but what we really need is for people to learn and get the model, make the models better.
So Priya, I know that you're doing a lot of work investing. So tell me, we've got companies in the UK lining up to invest in fintech in India. Tell me how much of your time you're spending with it. What are companies most interested in, people most interested in getting involved in?
Well, I think what's most exciting about the sort of UK-India bridge on fintech is that there is the story of the sort of the big known players, and you mentioned Revolut and others who are so well known globally now and are really sort of driving into the Indian market. But it's also an area where fantastic smaller SMEs on both sides can play. And I think that's where the opportunity really lies. A great example is a company called Credit Enable, which happens to be run by an amazing female founder called Nadia Sood, who's launched in India recently as her first market. So the company's headquartered here, but launching in India because the model, it's a credit, so SME lending platform, can work very, very effectively in the India market. So I think there's a story there for the big companies. There's also a story for the up-and-coming startups on both sides of the India-UK relationship. And that's, I think, where the excitement is.
And within that, within the sector of fintech, you mentioned credit, we've talked about that, talked a little bit about crypto, but what else are you in particular looking at?
Well, I mean, I think what you're seeing is the whole gambit of fintech solutions have a play in India. That's the beauty of such a large, diverse market. So it might be something targeted specifically at the millennials, the younger generation that we were just talking about there, or it might be something targeting rural populations who might have historically been excluded. There's actually an opportunity for almost every part of the financial services market to find a place to grow their business in India, and that's just a fantastic opportunity for everybody.
We are running out of time, Sanat. I want to get back to you one more time. The Indian banking ecosystem considered ahead, actually, of the UK in terms of technology adoption. It's been very, very quick. We've got lower cost-to-income ratios as well compared to the banks in the UK. You work 70% with nearly 70% of financial institutions in India. So can you share a few lessons that you think could be learned by UK financial institutions?
I think today, if there's one message that from a technology provider point of view we'd give to banks, it is that there's no shortage of capability on the technology side to support any business idea. Technology is no longer the hindrance. And I'll give you one example to pick up on what Priya just said. In India, for example, if you take something like blockchain, the blockchain's been around for a while now. It's not really been productionized in the sense that a lot of banks are still experimenting with it. They're doing proofs of concept, but not necessarily taking it to production. We've got 18 banks in India who've come together, both independent banks, public sector banks, and foreign banks, who've created a blockchain network to facilitate trade finance transactions. Now, as we know from banking, trade finance is the most document-heavy part of banking. They've created that with the intention of driving turnaround times down by 85%. And these are 18 different banks, right? 18 culturally very different banks who've come together to create this on a blockchain. Now, the end benefit to whether it's a small, a business that's looking for a letter of credit, whether it's a medium-sized enterprise looking for some kind of trade finance, the benefit that these people are able to get, the end beneficiary, is huge. At the same time, a new technology like blockchain brings in the capability of more security, more control, and so on. So I think today, for anyone willing to experiment and truly leverage what new technology can offer here in the UK, I'd say that there's enough examples and more of technology capability, but more importantly also of organizations and banks in other parts of the world which have experimented and tried and succeeded. Right? I think we need to move beyond this mindset of saying, let's keep experimenting, because the world has moved. In the last 18 months, it's proven that you can't keep on experimenting. It's time to take it into production, right? So I think that's the, and the biggest single factor of the last 18 months has been technology. So I think, Fintechs here in the UK and the banking system here in the UK really needs to look at technology afresh. And there are great examples already. I mean, we talked about a few of them, but they're great examples.
Oh, I'd like to stay on this all day. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. So thank you very much to my virtual guest, to Swastik Nigam from Winvesta. Thank you also to my friends here on stage, Priya, Guha. We've had Gurdeep Singh Kohli and also Sanat Rao. We'll be back in just a moment.